As you heard, since October 2021, I have been appointed as the United Nations Special Rapporteur in the field of cultural rights. United Nations Special Rapporteurs are part of the special procedures. Special procedures are said to be the eyes and the ears of the United Nations when it comes to human rights. We are appointed for as independent experts. So although I am Greek, I have not been nominated by my state, and I do not represent my state, and neither do the other special rapporteurs. We're appointed for 3 years plus 3 years, and we're here to monitor the focus, the implementation of the rights that are within our mandate. There are 45 thematic special rapporteurs at the moment from all over the world, and working groups. The right to life, prohibition of torture, freedom of expression, etc. And there are 14 special rapporteurs on specific countries, the latest of which is the newcomer, is the Russian Federation. In my work, I publish 2 thematic reports every year on issues that I feel are important for my mandate for cultural rights. And I also go to official visits. My first official visit was in Germany, where I focus on the implementation of cultural rights and the successes, good practice, but also maybe challenges to be overcome. And finally, next one is going to be Panama, next official visit, and then I'm going to come in the region, the Arab region. So I'm going to be in Jordan, and next April, I think, April, May, hopefully, and finally, a very important part of my mandate is to receive communications, so to receive allegations of violations of human rights by individuals, and they can just send me an email, and then I get into, with names and details, and then I get into a confidential dialogue with the state. And 2 months later, the state can either answer to me, or what we call name and shame. So I go public and I say that I think that this state has committed this violation, or has not answered in a way that is coherent, consistent with consistent standards of international law. This is an unpaid role, and at the same time in order to pay my mortgage, I am a professor of laws, as you heard, at Brunel University, London, and I focus on human rights. I come from minority and indigenous rights. This is what my PhD was, and what I focused on, and gradually I became known for the cultural rights, especially of indigenous peoples and minorities, and multiculturalism, integration, and then I was appointed. And since my appointment, I was very interested in the cultural rights of migrants, and because we talk a lot when it comes to migrants. I feel that we talk a lot about their short-term challenges, which I understand are very important. So challenges that they face with abuse from police, challenges that they change with discrimination, challenges that they face with living conditions. But we don't talk so much about the long-term challenges that they face that has to do with their own identity. So we focus so much on their physical survival, which of course is very important, essential, but we don't talk as much about their spiritual and identity survival. And this is why I thought it was very important to talk about this. In 2015, when the so-called crisis, refugee crisis started in Europe, I was asked from friends in Athens to get involved in what was to be called the Athens Refugee Project. So I started taking British students, law students to Athens, where they volunteered with the refugees. And there it became, and then it became quite well known and was awarded a few awards as a project. But there I think that we all noticed how these people wanted to tell their stories, wanted to share their practices, their cultural practices, wanted to discuss their philosophies and their ways of life, to share their ways of life, but somehow they were not able to, as if they should be grateful for being tolerated. And that's why I thought it was very important. I had spoken at the time to the UNHCR, and they had told me that, no, we haven't done any work on cultural rights of migrants and refugees. The IOM also, the International Organization for Migration, also has not really focused on this area. So I thought that, this is something that was missing, and that's why this report came so early on during my mandate. So an estimated 280 million people, so approximately 3.6% of the world population, currently live outside the country of origin. And I think that one of my main challenges was the definitions, was who this report was going to be about. Because even the international organizations give different definitions to specific people. So the facts that I had was that it is not up to the state to define who is a refugee and who isn't. In Hersey Jamal case, the European Court of Human Rights, but also the UNHCR previously in 1999, had both confirmed that it is not up to the state to decide who is going to be a refugee. It is up to the state to declare that this person is a refugee. Refugee is a person that fulfills the criteria of the 1951 Convention on Refugees. So who's going to call these people refugees is irrelevant. What is important is that whether they are or they are not. And this is especially important because, for example, in Greece and in Italy, we see a lot of people who are on the boats. We've seen less than a month ago, 700 people on a boat that unfortunately was capsized. And these people, I think more than 500 of these people now are missing. And the news kept calling them migrants. And why did they call them migrants? Because, of course, the media and maybe some states would like us to make the distinction between migrants and refugees. So definitely in Europe, refugees are considered these people who are running away for the survival of their physical survival. And it is a noble cause, trying to escape and trying to survive and to save their families. Whereas when we talk about migrants, there are these people who want to come to Europe because Europe is the paradise and want to come to take the jobs of the Europeans. So, the media narrative is that refugees are the good guys and migrants are the bad guys. Whenever we talk about, people on the move, you'll see that the conservative with small c media will talk about migrants, will refer to them as migrants. Whereas when we talk about some people that we want to, that we sympathize, the media would call them refugees. So Syrians in Europe, we like them a lot, they're refugees. But, other people that we don't like so much, they're migrants. So the definition for me was very important. And somebody said, maybe we should call them people on the move, because they have the same needs, and especially when it comes to cultural rights, their needs are pretty much similar. But I thought people on the move may be introducing yet another definition. And sometimes the more definitions we introduce, the more we lose the essence of the debate. So I thought, no, I'm going to say, as a lot of people say, that migrant is a person who has left the borders, the state that where they enjoy protection from, and they have moved to another state. Now, the reasons why they have moved to another state is something that we can talk about. And within the migrants, in the wider sense, we also have refugees who are the specific people who are they're being persecuted and fulfill the specific definition of the 1951 Refugee Convention. I have to tell you that even that was a bit of a statement. At the moment, you heard from Abdullah that I am completing actually an EU project on migration and technological tools to predict migration inflows. And the European Union officials were shocked that I was referring to everyone as refugee, because they said, no, refugees are only the ones that we say are refugees. So I had to say that actually that's not true. Refugees are the people who belong to the criteria that have been set by the international community. So I decided that refugees, in this report on migration and cultural rights, refugees are also going to be included, and I said that from the very beginning. Another issue that I realized, and this is maybe just for the people who engage in advocacy, a lot of the migrants are actually minorities, but they are not being called minorities, because if they're called minorities, they have to be given additional protection. So, for example, the Turkish and Greek immigrants in Germany, they're not immigrants, they're minorities, but the German state refuses to recognize them as such for whatever reasons, but the result is that they're not given the protection that they should have been given by international law. So for this reason, I think that I also put in the report that a lot of these people are also minorities, and we should treat them as minorities and give them their rights. So after dealing with the definitional issues that were quite difficult and challenging, I started talking about their cultural rights. And first of all, I was really surprised that what I thought was pretty obvious became the main sentence that people put on social media. What I said was migration is good. Migration is good. Migration is good for the people who move to another state because it is challenging, but it opens their eyes to new cultures, new philosophies, new viewpoints, new ways of life. And by opening our eyes to new ways of life, we stand critical to our own ways of life, our own cultures. And we decide maybe to revisit some of these practices that we have, or to say that we like these practices and they're fine and we continue to maintain them. But migration is also good for the host countries. And it's not because of the additional pairs of hands. It's not because of economic reasons. It is much more deep than that. Migration, it's really good because the country itself is going to, and the people who live in the host country are going to come across with different ideas. And through different ideas, we have more innovation, we have more creativity, we have new ideas and again, reevaluation of our own practices. So this was something that I had not realized how much it had to be confirmed and noted. And it became quite a part of the report that was talked about a lot. But this is not to say that migration is easy. Migration is challenging. Migration puts at risk a lot of our cultural characteristics. And when we talk about cultural rights and cultures in international law, but I think now also in other disciplines, we are sure that we're not just talking about specific buildings, and we're not just talking about heritage. When we talk about cultures and cultural rights, we mean our way of life. So this has been confirmed by UNESCO. So UNESCO also views cultures as ways of life, but it has also been confirmed by the UN. And when we talk about cultural rights, we mean about ways of life. So we don't just don't just discuss the buildings that were have changed or specific practices and customs only. It is much wider than this. So we talk about philosophies, histories, films, theatrical plays, but also ideas, viewpoints, opinions, sports, food. So all this is part of culture, and international law recognizes that the state has to not only not violate these, but also take specific measures to actually protect these rights. And the main instrument that we have for this reason is the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, which says, and has been signed and ratified and is binding for a lot of states, says that everyone, not just citizen, not just somebody who lives permanently somewhere, everyone, prisoners, children, people we don't like, women, people with varied gender characteristics, everyone has the right to take part in the cultural life. So for a long time, states felt that this meant, no, first of all, this provision is not just a provision that applies to states that have signed and ratified this treaty. This provision now is considered customary international law. So this means that it doesn't really matter. I don't have to go and see and check whether Lebanon has signed and ratified this convention. I don't have to go and see whether Greece has signed and ratified this convention. This applies to everyone because the international community has realized that the right to take part in culture is so important as members of humanity that, it is our right, as our inherent right. So everyone has the right to take part in the cultural life. At the beginning, states said, okay, so this means that people and migrants have to take part in the cultural life of the state. And this is absolutely true. So this means that migrants should be allowed to, should have access to important events, should have access to libraries and to museums and to cinemas and to public spaces. And no one should ask them for their papers in order to allow them to be in these cultural spaces. This means that they have the right to access in the same way that we have the right to non-migrants. Actually, I am a migrant because I live in the UK and I'm Greek. But, kind of non-migrants have the same right. And essentially, this is part of the overall umbrella of international law on non-discrimination, which now we know is not just about formal equality, but it is about substantive equality. So we recognize as an international community that migrants are vulnerable individuals. They're not vulnerable individuals because of who they are. They're not vulnerable individuals because of where they come. They're just vulnerable individuals because they have left part of their soul, part of their identity somewhere else. And the majority of the people where they are are have other philosophies and other viewpoints, etc. So it is the migration that has turned them to vulnerable individuals, and we have to ensure that their cultural rights are materialized at an equal level as the non-migrants. And this is something that very often I hear from states. So states will say, we have these amazing laws. We have these laws that make sure that migrant rights, including cultural rights, are guaranteed. But this is not what international law says. International law says, okay, but we have to look at what happens in practice. It is not just about what happens in law. And at least in Greece, I see that, for example, people who live in camps, they don't have any access to their cultural festivities. They have very limited access to their customs. They have very limited access to take part in the cultural life of the state. So very often when they come to big cultural festivals, the police is going to go asking them for their papers. The people around them are going to treat them almost like either already criminals or criminals to be decided upon. So very often we'll see that the ladies hold their bags really tightly the moment they see somebody of a different color, that sometimes mothers say, come here to their child. So these are specific ways in which in which the society puts obstacles, real obstacles, to migrants in order to participate in the cultural life. So the state has obligation not only to allow them, not only not to stop them from attending these communal spaces and events, but they have the obligation to ensure that these obstacles are removed. And a lot of states say to me, well, we're looking for your innovative, creative measures that you're going to tell us, and what is your experience? Tell us the best practice. Well, the best practice is to stop dehumanizing them. And you stop dehumanizing them, but by ensuring that in the news, you're not going to hear it is believed that it is migrants who actually, in Greece in the 90s, it is believed that an Albanian person committed a crime. It is believed that the culprits were foreigners. It is believed that we're not really sure, it is believed by whom. And very often we see that these are just bias and prejudices. I think one of the most painful experiences that I have of migrants is when I was in Greece and I went to a friend's, good friend's house, and the good friend's mother had somebody who would help her, a domestic worker in the house, and this domestic worker had brought his son. And my friend had peeled and cut an apple for my goddaughter, and she presented the cut apple to the daughter, and then the little boy just went to take a piece of apple, and the grandmother just went, not you. So it doesn't need to be the state. We keep looking to the state, and this morning we were discussing about strong states and failed states and failing states and weak states. But really, when it comes to non-discrimination, it starts from the society, and it starts from specific prejudices we all have. So substantive equality is really important, and it is applied horizontally when it comes to access to cultural events. But substantive equality also requires the state to take measures to ensure that there is no hate speech in the media, measures to ensure that their own officials do not engage in discriminatory language, measures to ensure that stereotypes are not maintained, but they are crushed. And this can happen in education very early on, but it can also happen in informal situations. So for this reason, measures to create common spaces. So I don't know whether you have followed in London, we keep talking about multicultural society, multicultural society, multicultural society. Yet, really, my understanding is that it is full of little clusters of communities that do not really know so much about each other. So, North London is where the Greeks and the Turks are. And, in other places of London is where the Eastern Europeans are. Ealing is, you'll see the Polish. And all these create, South London, you'll see the Black community. And North London, you'll see, West London, sorry, you'll see the kind of Italians. So, I trust the Italians to be in a nice place of London. But anyway, so you'll see, that, we have a cluster of communities, and you actually talk about segregation. So if you just living the one next to the other doesn't make us know about each other. So I think that, what I say in the report is that a very big part of materializing cultural rights has to do with ensuring that there is interaction among migrants and the majority of the population, and there is intercultural debate and intercultural exchange. And this can only happen if common spaces are created. And common spaces can be the schools, common spaces can be the square, where children talk and grown-ups discuss their daily activities. But I think that this is not enough. International law does not want us only to allow migrants to ensure that migrants can participate in the collective life of the state. I think that international law also focuses on the lives of the migrants and the cultures of the migrants. So it goes in a dual way. On the one hand, we have to ensure that they have access to the life of the state or the mainstream society, but on the majority society, whichever you want to call it. But at the same time, they have to be allowed to express themselves in their own cultures and express their own philosophies and their own ways of life. And I think that sometimes this is becoming more difficult. Now, I say that being quite aware that I am in a place where communities live with each other in a much more maybe anarchic, but also much more peaceful way. Today and yesterday, I've talked to Syrians and Palestinians and people from Egypt, but people from Lebanon that live in Tunisia, but they've come from Tunisia, but for 10 years they were in Iran and they left Iran because all these kind of huge meddling, all this huge interaction means that maybe people do not live as much in silos as in other parts of the world. Or at least that the societies realize that everybody can continue to have their own cultures. This is not the case everywhere. And we have many states at the United Nations that are very negative towards discussing measures for migrants to celebrate their own cultural frameworks. And what they usually say, what these states usually put forward is that if we allow migrants to have their own ways of life, essentially, we run the risk of oppressing individuals. So the argument goes that, of course, we want migrants to come to our state, but they have to respect our way of life. And respecting our way of life also means they have to respect human rights. And when I hear that, for example, in the UK, cannot but smile a little bit, because the way of life in the UK has a lot to do with colonialism and stealing resources from other people. So I don't think that the ways of life in the UK and the history of the UK is this very honorable human rights past that we're going to pass to the other countries. And the same thing in Germany. In Germany, I did my first official visit, and it's only now, I think very recently, that they have started being in touch and reflecting on their own colonial past. So this idea that some states have the ownership of human rights is false and maintains in a different way cultural imperialism. So we don't have imperialism, economic imperialism now, but we have cultural imperialism. You northern people, can come to our countries only if you accept that, we respect human rights and we are really much more. You want to call it civilized? You want to call it advanced? And these days we don't have this language. However, we have the same perceptions. And it also kind of makes me smile because when we talk about women's rights, because of course, if anything, the Me Too kind of debate shows us that gender equality has not really been achieved in the US. And has not really been achieved in various parts of the world. Actually, it has not been achieved in any part of the world. So this idea that migrants should come and respect our ways of life is false, but also it maintains the status quo and structures that are quite colonial, but also it is untrue. The human rights exist in all places. We all have common values, and we have a lot to learn from each other, and we have a lot to learn from migrants in the same way that hopefully migrants have a lot to learn from majorities. So for this reason, I think it is very important to recognize that migrants also have the right to maintain their own cultural frameworks. This does not mean that one has to be romantic. Cultures, human rights violations are constantly being maintained in the name of religion and in the name of culture. LGBT rights are constantly being violated in the name of this very vague notion of culture. Women's rights are constantly being violated around the world in the name of this, quote, this is how we are and this is how we do things here. But this is not something that migrant communities have the ownership of. This is something that majority communities also have the ownership of. So, for example, I am the majority in Greece, but as a woman, when I had my menstrual cycle, I could not go to the church because I was seen as polluted. So I was in a majority, and my rights were violated by the way my religion was interpreted by in the society, so by my culture. So we have to keep an eye on that, of course, and we have to ensure that cultural rights do not violate individual rights, of course, but not just in the migrant societies, in all societies, majority societies, minority societies, migrant societies, refugee societies, everywhere. Also domestic violence. I remember when I was a kid, I am much older than a lot of you, but I remember when I was a kid that, receiving a smack or two was not such a big thing. So, it isn't that suddenly, domestic violence has become something that we only see in migrant societies. So all these are used as ways to undermine migrant cultures, because majority people all over the world are afraid, are being pushed by elites or by whoever to be afraid of the other and to try to stay in little boxes. And this, apart from making a sociological observation, is against the standards of international law that we have at the moment in our humanity, in this world. So what I say to states and what I say in the report is that international law does have the tools to deal with these issues. And, this means that these conflicts, and we see these conflicts very often. So unfortunately, very recently, we saw similar conflict that happened with the burning of the Quran in Sweden and Germany. And we saw that we had to make the balancing between the right to expression and the right to religion. And my understanding is that maybe the United Nations at that specific moment could not help states to reach a consensus about the balancing of the two rights. But maybe when it comes to cultural rights and women's rights, cultural rights and LGBT rights, cultural rights and children's rights, we can use the tools that international law has given us to reach a consensus and also reach a balancing. So legality, so any restriction of human right, including cultural rights, has to be included in a domestic law. Legitimacy, any restriction of cultural rights has to be done for a very specific aim. And proportionality, that cultural rights are going to be restricted only to the extent absolutely necessary to achieve the aim we want. So, for example, not to violate the rights of others. So ways of life is very much a very important issue when it comes to migrant cultural rights, because the balancing that needs to be done. But another very important issue has to do with the cultural sector. So migrants who are artists tell us that when they go to the host country, they face obstacles to their artistic expression. The obstacles vary. So sometimes the obstacles are just that they don't have the funds to continue to be artists. Other times, the obstacles mainly have to do with the fact that in order to get funding, they have to become the token migrant. So they have their art to be only about migration, their film to be only about their trauma in leaving Syria to come to Greece. So it has to be always about this. Otherwise, funding is not being given. And when there are, and the final thing that they tell us is that sometimes their art is considered, the type of art that they engage in is very different to the host country's art. So it is not evaluated correctly and it is not valued as much. So sometimes the North American art scene does not really understand very well the Middle Eastern, let's say, art scene and artistic expression. And I will always remember this discussion that I had with this. I can't remember her name, Vanessa, this Iranian female rapper who now lives in Sweden. And she said to me that the most difficult question everyone keeps asking her in Sweden is, so do you like it here? Because this, she says, invites her to say, I'm so grateful that you brought me to Sweden. And she cannot say, actually, no, I really miss my friends. I really miss the trees that I had. I really miss the food. I really miss, the place, the square that I used to go and sing, etc. So I think artists face a lot of obstacles. Artists face obstacles. I heard yesterday in the fantastic training that Basma did, and it was training for me actually, more than for the participants, the difficulties artists have in the freedom of movement. So in order to move, in order to sing somewhere else, the difficulties also they have in being registered as artists in the host country. And we also have the invisibility of migrants in mainstream artistic expression. So how many of us follow soap operas that have real migrants in them? How many of us see a migrant as a news speaker in the news? How many of us see migrants on TV, on theater, etc.? I have a very good friend, a Greek friend in London, and he says to me that he has given up now being having what he calls a proper job as an actor, because he's always going to be the Greek, the Syrian, the Turkish, the Kurdish, kind of his face is going to fit in specific places. So I think that it is very important for the state to ensure that these obstacles are heard and these obstacles are also addressed. And these obstacles are especially important when it comes to asylum-seeking artists, because these artists are invited very often to stay in camps where they don't have the freedom to go around and practice their art. And also a lot of them have fled the country abruptly and without proper documentation. Sometimes they're forced to go into hiding from the authorities and are unable to access their host country's social and cultural life. This rapper in Sweden was saying to me that the second most important challenge she faces is that she faces backlash from and racism from the local community, from the host community, but she also faces backlash from back home because they see her as having changed, be different now, not belonging with them. And all these are issues that states have to take into account. And of course, the need to communicate information is also very important. Information to artists that they would be able to understand. One of the recommendations that I made was the need, as I said before, for common public cultural spaces. And I think this is very important. And one of the most fantastic things that I discovered through doing this report, and I'm coming to an end, is the fantastic role that NGOs play in maintaining and protecting and developing cultural rights of migrants in many states. So NGOs have taken the role of the state to ensure that they are respectful and open in the cultural rights and the cultural frameworks of the migrants. But also it goes further than that. A lot of NGOs around the world use culture as a way to push for the human rights of migrants. So, for example, the Migrant Voice in Glasgow is a migrant-led organization that has collaborated with the University of Glasgow and initiated media skills training for people with experience of migration using cultural tools. The Athens Refugee Project has seen, we created an online game for migrant children. So we recognize that migrant children really like to play online games, and this is the same with all children in the world at the moment. You cannot really take them away from their computer or their parents' phones. So we created an online game where there is a superhero, and the superhero has to fight all these obstacles and difficult situations in which they are found. So, for example, the football pitch is locked. Is the superhero that we don't know, it has a cap, so we don't know whether it's a girl or a boy. So is the superhero, or something in between. So the superhero is going to go and ask the key from the authorities. What happens if the authorities push them out? What happens? Are they going to break the lock? So real things that migrant children have told us that they face. And then every time they do the right thing, they take points in resilience, so that they can have, and then finally they have a superpower. So, these are some of the creative ways that the sector has come up with to push forward for human rights of migrants, but also of other sectors of the population. So the recommendations that we made are many, and I'm not going to go through all of them, but I think that the main recommendations that I would make in this space is that, of course, we have to remind states that they have signed specific obligations. So there are legal obligations, the ones they have, in order to protect the cultural rights of migrants. They have to ensure that these rights, that these persons are empowered. If they really want to talk about integration, integration means that the state allows these people to become real partners in the vision of the society, in the future of the society, which means that they criticize the whole society, they take part in the whole society, they lead programs in the whole society, they lead museums and exhibitions, and they create films, and they show films, and they criticize, as I said, through their art, the local society. So I think that, yes, it is important to do that, but at the same time, I think it is very important to say that the state is the state, and even if there is a failing state or a weak state, the society also has the responsibility to ensure that prejudices are identified, stereotypes are identified and crushed down in different ways. I'm sure that non-governmental organizations are going to do it in some ways. We as individuals are going to do it in other ways. And this is, I believe, the only way. So crushing down this idea of the other, this is the only way to ensure that each one of us, either whether migrant or refugee or a member of the majority, can use human rights to achieve the best version of themselves. Thank you. What an interesting question, and what a difficult question. So this is something that we all struggle with. And of course, it's very interesting because when I say this to students, I go on legality, legitimacy, proportionality. I have my little legal boxes ready and, kind of the definitions and everything. And then the students just look at me and say, who's going to decide this then? And I'm like, the state, I guess. And they just lose complete interest. Like, okay, if the state is going to decide. So I think that proportionality is, again, the restricting cultural rights only to the extent that is absolutely necessary to, and for the aim that is absolutely necessary to achieve this aim. So, for example, at the moment we have a lot of discussion about development. And there are a lot of places where development projects relocate local populations. So, for example, in Latin America, I'm not sure whether you have the same problem here, but in Latin America, you have a lot of local populations that are being relocated, irrespective of whether they want or not, so that the big project from big transnational corporations is being established in their areas, their lands. And what the states say is that in Asia as well, what the states say is that this is for so sometimes they say this is for the development of the state. This is for the interest of the state. Okay, states do not have rights. They should say this is for the interest of the population. So sometimes they do. Sometimes they say this is for the wider, the greater good. That's it, the greater good. So there you have to make a balancing and say, okay, so the greater good goes against, if you see it as the states presented, is that, 10 million people are going to benefit from 50,000 losing their lands. But then you have to take into account, is there any other place where this specific project can take place so that their cultural rights are not violated? If their cultural rights are violated and they have to be relocated, can they have a say on where they're going to be relocated? Can they have a say on whether they're going to have any benefits from this project, as they are the ones that sacrificed their cultural rights? Can they return back in 10 years' time? Can we have a museum somewhere where we're going to have everything that they have had in this specific land? So there are a lot of alternatives that can happen. And the states usually kind of essentialize the whole debate in, well, it's for the wider good, we're going to take it and that's it. But there are a lot of areas where we can, a lot of parts where we can use in order to make these restrictions much easier for the local populations. This is, for example, something that the World Bank has realized, and that's why now they have a new environmental and social standards that say that the lands have to be protected, and if there is relocation, the state is going to have to give at least compensation or a land equal in value and equal in value to the land that they have taken apart. This is one example. The second example, I'm going to give it from my own experience and my own writings. I have done quite a lot of thinking about the women's rights, and quite a lot of thinking about the wearing of they're called religious clothings, but in my mind, they're religion, but also how religion is interpreted. So it is part of culture. Because very often in Europe, they're going to say, especially in London, maybe you know that the former Secretary of State said that women who wear the headscarf and, the veil, and only had their eyes open, they were like post boxes. So these women come to me and they're like post boxes because I can only see their eyes. So, but at the same time, I grew up in a society that did not have, headscarves and covering. So I had to kind of find a way to say, what do I say? And some people have said that no, women should not, women are essentialized and their rights are violated if they wear the veil. And by saying that it's part of their culture and they should be allowed to wear the veil, I become a cultural relativism apologist, yes. So I had a lot of thinking about that. And in essence, I think that it is the women themselves that should tell us whether they want, so the affected group, in this case the women, who are going to tell us whether they want to wear the veil or not. I think that, and it's the women themselves that are going to tell us whether there has been a violation or not. So wearing the headscarf, I think that most women are going to say that this is not a violation. This is just a practice they have. They're very colorful headscarves. They're fantastic. I don't see a problem. Wearing the veil, I will go back to the women. And this is a bit of a clash that has existed between feminism Western feminism and Eastern, if you want, women. Because women themselves have said, hang on a second, don't treat me like a child. I know, don't keep portraying me as an oppressed woman, that I cannot have an opinion on what to wear, and what I wear is just the outcome of oppression in my family. I am fine, and I'm telling you that wearing the veil is the way I want to live my life. And actually, if anything, I see you, Western woman, who has to be specific kilos, has to have a specific beauty, has to have straight hair, has to have this and that and the other, as the really oppressed one. Because, you know, nobody's going to say whether a man is, I still remember when I go to Greece, you know, my relatives, they're going to say, oh, Stelios got married to this woman. He has an amazing job. It's a lovely couple. He has an amazing job and she's so beautiful. Okay, you know, who is the oppressed here? So for this reason, I think that I will ask the women themselves. I will listen to the women themselves. So the group in question, but also I will ensure that the women have what Susan Okin says, the right to exit. So I will ensure that the women have the education and the socioeconomic rights to be able to reject the cultural practice if they so wish. Because otherwise, if the woman doesn't have a job, if the woman doesn't have education, then a woman is stuck and is not going to be able to reject anything from her culture. And I think that's how I would see what happens in this balancing of the rights. But you're right, it's very difficult and it can only happen ad hoc. So I will tell you how things should be and then how things are. So international law and the United Nations pays a lot of attention at the interdependence of human rights and the indivisibility of human rights. So we keep saying how human rights should not be cut in little pieces and should not be seen as civil, political, socio-economic, cultural, but they're all together. And the reason why they're all together is that the person whose viewpoints and whose philosophies we don't know about is the person that is going to be dehumanized. So the police is going to feel more comfortable violating their civil rights. And this also means that because they're very afraid, they don't have the right to education really, which means that they will never have living conditions. So cultural rights, civil rights, economic rights are all affected, and social rights are all affected. So this is how it goes. The reality is that cultural rights, I keep saying, are the Cinderella of human rights. The reality is that emphasis is definitely still being given very much on civil and political rights. The global South, somebody said to me to call it the majority, the global majority. So the global majority pushed for economic, social, and cultural rights, and they achieved the instruments. However, the emphasis is certainly on economic and social, but mainly economic rights. This is what we're trying to do with my emphasis, because apart from migration, my other emphasis is on development and cultural rights. And what I have argued is that, and a lot of us actually argue, is that, I don't say anything new, is that development is not only economic, development has a cultural aspect, and we have to recognize and value the cultural aspect of development, so cultural development. Unfortunately, at the UN level, because the UN is the collection of states, so the collection of states still value very much the civil and political rights. And we see that very clearly in documentation about artistic freedom. So documentation about artistic freedom very often refers to the right to expression. But it's not the right to expression, because the right to expression is a civil and political right. But it's not the right to expression, because artistic freedom has to do with creativity. It's not just the right to express yourself. It is the right to use your creativity to express yourself. So in this respect, it is a cultural right. However, the emphasis in funding, but also in discussions is on civil rights. So there is this state that is not going to be named that give a lot of emphasis on artistic freedom, but they want me to look at artistic freedom as part of freedom of expression. I cannot do that.
It's a state up in the north.
Yeah, up, very cold. So I cannot do that, which means that I don't have funding. My mandate doesn't have funding, which means that funding goes to civil and political rights, which means that my voice is weaker than the voice of civil and political rights, and then it just becomes a vicious circle. And yes, you're right, this is how it goes. And this is why the only way we can stop this is if we are vocal and we say again and again and again how artistic freedom is a cultural right. It has to do with creativity. I think that the most amazing thing about, I adore my role. I kind of love it. But partly why is because cultural rights have to do with identity, and cultural rights have to do with creativity. And I think that the more we say that, they have to do with what Farida Shahid, the first special rapporteur in this field, said, the right to inspire, the right to use the past in order to build the future. And this is why I think cultural rights are really important. Yes, I think you're absolutely right. And if I may say, I think that, I come very much from, as I said, indigenous and minority rights, so racialized groups. But I think that now maybe we have gone so far to the, ethnic and national origin and color that we don't take into account so much the class system, which is, and the discrimination on the basis of class. And we keep saying about the caste system, but the caste system also has to do with different classes. So intersectionality is our only way out, I think. So recognizing that individuals have multiple identities and multiple loyalties and multiple characteristics. So I can be a migrant and at the same time I can be belong to the LGBT, I can have a disability, and I can be of a different, a different class. Very interestingly, in the UK, in education, the state always paid a lot of attention at minorities and the education of minorities. And we found out that statistics suggest that it is the worst achievers in education are the white British working class boys. So it is not only about nationality and ethnic origin. So intersectionality. Very important question. And I think that the NGOs that are doing work on minority rights, as important as it is, they have to take into account the class as well in this respect. So, no, I don't know of any guidelines in specific. I know that, but maybe you know that as well. I'm sure that in the NGOs here, some training that has to do with sensitivities, so cultural sensitivities to deal with migrants and refugees, but this is as far as it goes. So cultural awareness and training, but this is as far as it goes. But some of the most important initiatives that I've seen, for example, I really believe in this idea of common spaces. I didn't know about this idea very much, but now I'm completely taken with this idea. So, for example, Barcelona has created a lot of spaces where, with art from different parts in one square, but art from different parts of the population, including migrants, and sometimes also living, ongoing, continuous art, so that you see kind of artists there, and then they start interacting, then they start talking. And I think this is a fantastic way of migrant artists understanding more about the actual culture of the place, and also getting into a dialogue and going like this. So I think that these are one of the best places. But also, for example, there is a fantastic orchestra in Germany that has 17 different nationalities, and they say that they are the international orchestra, and they choose different songs within the same space to play. So some of them belong to the majority, and some of them belong to different minorities and migrants. So again, just interaction. The development of the rights hero. We've written an article and I can pass it to you, but the development on the rights here is very interesting because it highlights all the exploitation that we did to artists. So basically, we came up with the idea, then we went to the media department of our university, and the media department were very interested in it, and they said, okay, we have, at Brunel University, we have a very good media department. So then we had a discussion, a very big discussion, where the artists, students, exploited students. So the artists were saying to us, well, we're thinking of doing it like this. So for example, to end up with this figure that has a cap and we don't know whether it's a man or a woman, oh my God, we spent so many hours talking about it and so many different pictures that were given to us and models in order to do that. And then they developed this prototype. And, I can tell you that my only contribution at that stage was, I really like the colors. Can we put more colors? And that was about it. And then we took it back to Greece, and we because we knew people from our work in the refugee world, we took it to children. And children were, at the beginning, they were not very interested, and then they became really interested because they started playing about who's going to win, always. And then we took it back, and now they have another. I have kind of said I don't have a lot more to offer, but this organization in Greece that is called DPP, the Center, I think, for the Rights of the Child, has had some funding to roll it out to schools. So they are developing it. They're making it more palatable, exploiting artists. And now they're rolling it out to schools. So, yeah, and this is the reality. The reality is that artists, are being, what we were saying earlier, that artists do not have secure jobs, and even more so when it comes to migrant artists, but artists in general, it continues. So yes, I have to say that we exploited them a bit. So this was a half good, half bad example, a good example with a few kind of bad points that I can spread. But, there are a lot of, so for example, movable libraries. I don't know, probably you have this idea as well. Movable libraries are amazing. And just asking migrants themselves, I think that the biggest, what I have realized, and I'm sure that in your work you have realized as well, is that giving them the respect, like asking them what they want to do and telling them, who's going to lead rather than tell me so that I can do it, gives, changes completely their kind of, their lives at this stage, because their lives has gone through so many hardships and so much disrespect that, small things kind of change. And of course, I'm Greek, I would say that sharing food is always important. But you had a question? So, yes, there are double standards. We cannot avoid that. There are double standards, and also there are states that want to talk, and all states want to talk about the neighbor. They never want to talk about themselves. So, it's amazing. The EU, when you talk about the human rights in the EU, basically they mean the human rights of others, of the other states, and the money they give to other states, human rights. They don't really mean the human rights that the EU kind of protects or does not, or violates. So you're absolutely right. And in the UN, at the moment, with Ukraine and with China, it has become so polarized that even me being there for less than 2 years, I can see which state is going to talk, and I can tell you, actually, we almost have a game now where I say to the team, this is what they're going to talk about. So I know exactly what, and this is not good. So double standards and polarization. At the same time, for example, my country is using the double standards to get away from their own weaknesses. Oh, the great powers do whatever they want, and that's why there is no human rights. The amount of times that I have heard this from taxi drivers in Greece, taking me from the airport home, is amazing. So this idea of saying that human rights means nothing, the United Nations means nothing, and all this is just a talking shop. That's not true. So in my mandate, I said that yesterday, only a month ago, we changed the US policy, and I mean we, 2 UN Special Rapporteurs, me and the UN Special Rapporteur on terrorism, on prohibition of terrorism, so on measures against terrorism. We changed the US policy when it comes to the art that the Guantanamo prisoners have created. So the US for some time thought that providing art lessons in space to prisoners would be beneficial for them, but then they thought that their art would be used once released, their art will be used as propaganda, so that's why they were taking ownership of their art. And we changed their policy, and now their art is given back to these people. They have ownership of their art, but also when they leave, when they're released, they can take it with them. And this is the US. And this is about something, Guantanamo, which is especially sensitive for the US. So successes do happen. And yes, there are double standards, but with, the carrot and the stick, you can go ahead. And human rights, we always knew that human rights is not only law. Human rights is in the interface between law and politics. So yes, it's more difficult, then it needs a little bit more sensitive treatment. But I think that we agree that there are double standards, but we can navigate them to some extent. So there is a website with a picture of mine with much better hair than this. And you can, if you put the UN Special Rapporteur in the field of cultural rights, the website comes up. And there there are calls for submission for specific, the thematic reports that we do. So I have just finished a thematic report, a second thematic report about development and cultural rights, talking about the international development governance, so World Bank, IMF, WTO, UNESCO, etc. But now the next report is going to be on the right to science, because it has not been done, and we're going to do it. I have to submit it by December, and then the one after that is going to be very relevant to where we are: ethnic conflict and transitional justice and cultural rights. And this is going to be to the General Assembly. So there are calls for submission. So I really appreciate if you can spend a couple of pages to send me your experiences and your thoughts and your ideas. So this is the first issue. The second issue is that there is a form you can find, as I said, in the webpage, and you can send me allegations against a specific country, and then I get into a confidential discussion with this country. So things are very often, things change after this confidential dialogue. And when things don't change during the dialogue, very often they change afterwards when the state is named and shamed. And no state wants to be shamed at the international level. So you can, send me there. But also, I think more generally, when it comes to cultural rights, there isn't a clear-cut civil society that deals with cultural rights. There is a civil society, very active civil society that deals with minorities, very active civil society that deals with refugees. But when it comes to cultural rights, we see that there isn't a very clear, and in the UN, we have these friends of the mandate, so it would be wonderful if you pass on your details and then you get information about the mandate. And we form a common community where we can discuss things, and I can take your opinions, and maybe I can get a better feel of what is happening on the ground. As a UN Special Rapporteur, I'm going to live in 4 years. However, the UN continues, and there's going to be another UN Special Rapporteur. So you need to, have a discussion with me if you're interested in these issues, but you also need to have a discussion, an ongoing discussion, with the Office of the United Nations, because they're going to stay, and they have a lot of expertise. Thank you so much for taking time. Thank you, and for the very good questions.